I was halfway through meal prepping for the week when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen, unknown number, New York area code. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Hello?" I said, wiping my hands on a dish towel. A woman's voice replied crisply, "Hi, this is Sandra from United Federal Bank. Am I speaking with Emily Carter?" My chest tightened. "Yes, this is Emily." Her tone stayed professional. "We're just calling to confirm a few final details regarding the $500,000 loan you applied for. Specifically, we need clarification on your employer's income verification." I stood frozen in my kitchen. "I'm sorry, a what?" I asked, blinking. "A $500,000 personal loan," she repeated. "The application was submitted 2 weeks ago with your signature, social security number, and full identity details." I dropped into a kitchen chair. "I didn't apply for any loan," I said slowly. "There has to be a mistake." A long pause followed. "Are you saying this wasn't you, Ms. Carter?" I couldn't breathe. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "No, that wasn't me," I said firmly. "I've never applied for a loan from your bank. Can you send me the documents?" Sandra's voice softened slightly. "Of course. We'll send everything to the email address we have on file." I quickly confirmed it, and she ended the call politely, but with tension in her voice. As soon as the line went dead, I ran to my laptop and opened my inbox. The documents came in like a slap to the face. It had my name, my social security number, my address, my old job title from 2 years ago. And at the bottom of every form, my signature. Only it wasn't mine. It was close. The handwriting was similar, but it was a poor imitation. And the most chilling part, the listed address wasn't mine anymore. It was my parents' house. I sat there in shock, staring at the screen. My mind tried to make sense of it, but the pieces didn't fit. Not yet. Who would do this? How did they get my information? My credit score was spotless. I'd been working so hard to save for a house, cutting out extras, skipping vacations, even taking on weekend shifts at the bookstore just to keep my budget airtight. A $500 K loan in my name would destroy everything I'd built. My first thought was identity theft. Maybe someone hacked my files, or maybe it was a scammer who got lucky. I picked up my phone and called my mom. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, sweetie, everything okay?" I didn't waste time. "Mom, did you or Dad take out a loan using my name?" There was a pause. "What? Emily, what are you talking about?" Her tone was innocent. Too innocent. "Just answer me," I said sharply. "Did you use my information for anything recently?" She laughed nervously. "Of course not. Why would we do that?" I wanted to believe her. I did, but something in her voice didn't sit right, and when I hung up the phone, I sat in silence, staring at the wall like it could give me answers. I didn't know what was worse, the idea that strangers had stolen my identity, or the sick feeling in my stomach that someone I loved, someone I trusted, had done it. My dad had been struggling with his contracting business for years. I knew he was behind on taxes. I knew he'd been asking around for help, even asking me if I could co-sign for a small loan a few months ago. I said no. I couldn't afford to risk my credit, and he understood, at least I thought he did. But now it felt like maybe he didn't take the no, maybe he just took. I felt rage bubble in my chest, twisting with betrayal. I knew what I had to do. I was going back to that house. And this time I wasn't coming with hugs or small talk. I was coming with questions, and they were going to answer them. I didn't sleep that night. I just kept staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning like a broken carousel. I kept asking myself, why would they do this to me? I wasn't rich, I wasn't even close, but I was careful. I was responsible. I kept my credit clean and saved every spare dollar. And they knew that. My parents knew how much my future meant to me. I'd sacrificed birthdays, holidays, and even relationships to stay on track. So why would they take the one thing I worked hardest to protect? By morning, my chest felt hollow from overthinking. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to my parents' house. It was still early, maybe 7:15 a.m., but I didn't care. If they were still in bed, I was going to wake them up with the truth. Their house looked the same, modest, with a peeling white fence and the porch swing still squeaking in the wind. I used my spare key and stepped inside. The smell of coffee hit me first, followed by bacon sizzling in the pan. "Emily!" My mom called from the kitchen. "You didn't say you were coming by." I walked in slowly, my eyes locking with hers. "Where's Dad?" I asked. Her smile faded. He's in the garage. I didn't wait. I turned and walked through the living room, down the hallway, and yanked open the door to the garage. My dad was hunched over a workbench, fiddling with some old lawnmower parts. He looked up, startled. Emily, something wrong? I stepped in, holding up my phone. Yeah, the bank called me yesterday about a $500,000 loan in my name. His face went pale. He didn't speak, he just looked at me, like he was searching for the right lie to tell. My mom had followed me down the hallway, standing behind me now. Emily, let's just all sit down. No, I snapped. No more sitting down. No more pretending. Someone applied for that loan using my name, and the documents have your address on them. My dad finally spoke, but his voice was small. We didn't have a choice. I blinked, stunned. So it was you? My mom stepped forward. Emily, please listen. Your father's business was falling apart. The banks wouldn't lend to us anymore. We just needed something to hold us over. We were going to pay it back, we swear. I took a step back like I'd been slapped. You forged my signature. You stole my identity. You risked my entire future. My voice cracked, but I didn't cry. I wouldn't give them that. My dad ran a hand through his thinning hair and sat down on an old folding chair. We didn't know what else to do. We thought we could fix it before anyone noticed. It was just supposed to be temporary. I stared at him like I didn't recognize him. You thought you could just borrow $500,000 in my name without telling me? What if the loan defaulted? What if I needed a house or a car or even a job that checks credit? My mom's eyes filled with tears. We're your parents, Emily. We took care of you for years. We were desperate. That's not love, I said flatly. That's theft. You didn't ask. You didn't give me a chance to say no. You just took. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. I felt the moment shifting. The version of them I'd held on to all these years, the ones who loved and protected me, was crumbling right in front of me. I turned to leave but stopped at the door. You need to fix this. Today. I'm giving you until tonight to call the bank and confess, or I will. My voice didn't shake. I didn't care if they cried. I didn't care if it tore our family apart. They made that choice when they used me like a financial escape hatch. As I stepped outside, the sun was rising behind their house, casting long shadows across the lawn. I didn't feel like their daughter anymore. I felt like a stranger, and from this point on, I wasn't playing nice. If they thought they could steal my future and get away with it, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. By the time I got back to my apartment, the weight of what had happened started to settle on my chest like a brick. My phone was buzzing every hour. My mom, my dad, my aunt, even my cousin Daniel, who rarely spoke to me, was suddenly texting, "Maybe don't overreact. They're family." Overreact? I laughed bitterly. My own parents committed identity fraud and signed a $500,000 loan in my name, and somehow I was the one who had to calm down. I knew how this would go. They'd spin it as a family misunderstanding, say it was out of desperation, try to guilt me into silence because they were older and struggling. But this wasn't some late-night argument or petty mistake. This was deliberate, strategic, criminal, and I wasn't going to let it slide. So I did what I should have done from the beginning. I called a lawyer. I'd met Jessica once before at a Women in Tech networking event. She was sharp, calm, and had this quiet fire behind her eyes that made you feel like nothing would get past her. I explained everything over the phone, my voice steady but firm. When I was done, she was silent for a second. You need to file a police report, she said, and you need to freeze your credit right now if you haven't already. This is serious, Emily. They didn't just sign something by mistake. This is a felony. Hearing those words out loud made my stomach twist, but I nodded to myself. Okay, what happens next? She walked me through the first steps, placing a fraud alert, pulling all 3 credit reports, contacting the bank again with legal language this time, and then she paused. Emily, I'm going to be honest. This could get ugly. If you pursue this legally, your parents could face jail time. Are you ready for that? I swallowed hard. They weren't thinking about my life when they did this. So yes, I'm ready. Later that afternoon, I drove back to their house one last time. But I didn't go in, I just parked across the street and waited. I needed to see their faces one more time before I made this official. And like clockwork, I saw it all from my windshield. My dad storming out the front door, red-faced, holding his phone to his ear. My mom sitting on the porch steps, crying like she was the one who'd been betrayed. I watched as my dad paced the sidewalk, no doubt calling the bank, or maybe his brother trying to figure out damage control. I knew their world was starting to crumble, and for the first time, I didn't feel bad. I wasn't proud, but I wasn't guilty either. I'd spent my whole life being the responsible one, the one who said no when it mattered, who paid every bill on time, who gave up little luxuries just to protect the future I was building, and they threw it all away in one selfish move. That night, I filed the police report. I submitted all the documents Jessica told me to gather, the loan application, the forged signature, the IP address tied to the online submission, which just so happened to match their home network. The officer who took my statement didn't flinch. He'd seen this before too many times. "It's always family," he said with a sigh. "People think they can get away with it because of blood, but blood doesn't pay off loans, blood doesn't repair credit scores, and blood doesn't erase betrayal." When I hit send on the final email to the fraud department attaching everything they'd asked for, I didn't feel like the same Emily I was just 2 days ago. Something had shifted. I was still hurt, still angry, but I wasn't broken. I was focused. And now that the process had begun, there was no turning back. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. But they'd forgotten who they raised. I didn't crumble. I rise. And I was just getting started. It only took 3 days for the ripple to turn into a wave. The first sign came in the form of a letter delivered to my parents' house, a formal notice from the fraud division of United Federal Bank. I didn't send it, but I knew exactly what it said. It was protocol after I submitted my claim. A full investigation was underway and their loan had been flagged. I found out through a text from my cousin Beth, who lived 2 streets over. "Mom said your parents got some kind of bank letter. Are you okay?" The family grapevine was already buzzing and the narrative was already shifting. I hadn't even told anyone the full story yet, but suddenly I was the villain, the daughter who dragged her own parents into legal trouble. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed quiet and waited. Jessica said this part would come. The guilt campaign, the whispered rumors, the twisted truths. "Don't defend yourself too early," she advised. "Let the facts unravel first. The louder they get, the clearer it becomes who's really hiding something." Sure enough, by the end of the week, my Uncle Dave called me. He was the peacemaker of the family, always trying to play both sides. "Emily's sweetheart," he started. "I heard about what's going on. Can we talk?" I let him talk for a good 5 minutes before I said a word. He used all the lines I'd expected. "They're your parents. They were under pressure. Nobody's perfect. Think of how hard it is for them." And then finally, the part that made my blood boil. "Maybe you don't have to push it so far. Just let it go. Handle it within the family." I laughed bitterly. "Uncle Dave, they stole my identity and signed a loan that could destroy my credit for years. If I didn't catch it early, I'd be the one buried in debt. And you want me to protect them?" He hesitated, his voice soft now. "I'm not saying protect them. I'm saying maybe give them a chance to fix it quietly." I hung up the phone before I said something unforgivable. Quietly was how they got away with it in the first place. Later that night, I opened Facebook, half expecting chaos, and there it was. My mother had posted a long, vague message. "Sometimes those you raise turn on you the fastest, but God sees our hearts. We did what we had to, and we are not ashamed." My hands trembled. She was painting herself as the victim. She had the audacity to imply I was the one who betrayed them. But I didn't comment. I didn't respond. Instead, I took a screenshot and saved it. I was building a timeline, just like Jessica told me to. "Every post, every message, every call you get from them, document it," she had said. "This isn't just about the fraud, it's about the manipulation too." And she was right. Because that post wasn't for her friends, it was for me. It was bait, a way to lure me into a public fight and shift the narrative before the truth hit the surface. But I was done playing defense. So instead of replying, I made my own move. I contacted the local credit union where I had my car loan and savings and asked to speak with the branch manager. I told them what had happened, explained the fraud alert now attached to my name, and warned them to lock down all of my accounts. If anyone comes in pretending to be me or asks about balances, don't even blink. Just call me, I said. The manager, a kind woman named Leslie, looked me dead in the eyes. "You've got it. We won't let them touch a thing." And just like that, another door closed on them. But the biggest shift came 2 days later, an email from the fraud department at United Federal. The subject line was cold and final. Loan account status, terminated pending investigation. They had frozen the loan. The money was never dispersed, thank God. And now, with evidence piling up, they were pushing forward with legal action. I sat on the edge of my bed, reading that line over and over again. A strange mix of relief and rage washed over me. I had stopped the disaster just in time, but the fact remained they would have let it happen. My parents would have taken the money, left me to deal with the consequences, and never said a word unless I caught them. That's the part I couldn't shake. Not the money, not even the fraud. It was the silence, the willingness to watch me drown and act like they didn't see it. That was the part I knew I'd never forget. And from that moment on, my mission wasn't just to protect myself. It was to make sure they never had the chance to hurt me or anyone else again. It started small, one neighbor, one whisper, one awkward glance at the grocery store. But within days, the truth spread through the community like wildfire. I didn't say a word to the press or make any public statements, but someone at the bank must have talked. Or maybe it was just the police report making rounds. Either way, people began to look at my parents differently. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, the sweet couple who led the community prayer chain and hosted Thanksgiving dinners, were now the couple who stole $500,000 from their own daughter. The first call came from my former high school teacher, Mrs. Donnelly. "Emily," she said gently, "I saw your mom at the pharmacy yesterday." She looked shaken. "Are you all right, honey?" I gave her the short version, just enough for her to understand. She didn't say much after that, just a long, tired sigh. "I'm proud of you for standing your ground. Not everyone could." I hung up with tears in my eyes. But not all the calls were kind. That night, I got a voicemail from my Aunt Tricia, Dad's sister. She didn't waste time sugarcoating. "Emily, you're tearing this family apart. Do you really want your father behind bars? He made a mistake, but he's still your dad." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. They still didn't get it. This wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. They acted like I was burning down the house, but they refused to admit who set the fire. Jessica called me later that evening with an update. "The bank's internal investigation is wrapping up. The case is strong. They've confirmed IP addresses, timestamps, and matching handwriting from prior applications your father submitted." I leaned back on my couch, letting it all soak in. "So what now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "we build your civil case. You could sue them for damages, emotional distress, credit repair costs, the works." I didn't respond right away. Part of me still couldn't believe it had come to this. The next morning, I woke up to another post from my mom, this time not vague. "Our daughter, Emily Carter, has accused us of a crime we didn't commit. She's letting money and pride ruin the bond we built as a family. We raised her better than this." I stared at the screen, the words burning into my brain. My jaw clenched. It was one thing to lie behind closed doors, but now they were trying to paint me as the aggressor in front of the whole town. My hands trembled, but I kept them steady as I typed my response. Not public, not dramatic. I simply messaged a few key people, mentors, friends, and neighbors I respected. I sent them the documents. The truth. "If you're hearing rumors, I just want you to see the facts for yourself," I wrote. The responses came quickly. Some were shocked, some offered apologies, and some, like Mr. Brooks from church, replied with only 3 words. "I believe you." I didn't want war, but they were pushing me toward it. For years, I'd been the quiet daughter, the respectful one, the achiever who didn't ask for much. But now, I was the woman they underestimated. And every lie they posted only gave me more power. I decided then that I wasn't just going to protect myself. I was going to win. Jessica helped me draft a civil suit that outlined every dollar I had spent to clean up their mess, every sleepless night, every job opportunity lost due to the investigation flag on my record. I filed it the next week. When they received the papers, they didn't call, they didn't text, they didn't post. For the first time in weeks, they were silent, and in that silence, I found my peace. But I wasn't done yet. They had tried to bury me with shame. It was time to show them I'd built a ladder out of every stone they threw. I got the call from Jessica just after lunch. "We've got movement," she said. "The bank has officially blacklisted your parents. All of their accounts are frozen, pending the outcome of the investigation." I didn't know what I expected to feel. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, but all I felt was quiet satisfaction. They had dragged my name through the mud. tried to flip the story in public, and now their lies were coming back to choke them. I imagined them sitting in their kitchen, trying to buy groceries, only to find out their cards didn't work. My mom, fumbling with her purse, my dad cursing under his breath, realizing the money was gone. It wasn't revenge, it was reality. And they were finally being forced to live in it. I pulled my blinds back just slightly and looked out into the sunlight. It was a clear day, the kind of day that used to make me miss home, but not anymore. That house no longer felt like a place I belonged. It felt like a scene of a crime. What they didn't know yet was that the financial fallout had only just begun. My civil suit had teeth, and one of the key points was my father's side business, a home repair service that he'd been running under the radar for years. He wasn't reporting half his income, but he had used that business to justify the fake loan under my name. Jessica found the paper trail. If they think they can just walk away with a shrug, they're wrong, she told me. We're requesting full disclosure of assets. That includes your mom's catering income too. I sat back, exhaling. My parents had always lived just a little above their means. Nice car, remodeled kitchen, vacation photos that made it look like they had everything figured out. But I knew the truth now. Their whole lifestyle had been propped up on borrowed time and broken promises. And I wasn't the only one finding out. I got a text from Rachel, one of my mom's best friends from the church group. It was short but brutal. I had no idea, Emily. I canceled our catering contract with her. I'm sorry. That was the moment it really hit me. People were watching. The same people who once praised my parents as pillars of the community were now seeing cracks in the foundation. One by one, the phone calls stopped. The likes and shares on my mom's pity post dried up. And when I scrolled back to her latest update, where she'd accused me of tearing the family apart, I noticed something different. The comments were gone. She turned them off. It was subtle but powerful. The silence meant one thing. People were choosing sides. And for once, they weren't choosing hers. A few days later, Jessica called with a grin in her voice. "We got our first win," she said. "The judges issued a temporary injunction. They can't touch or transfer any assets until this case is resolved." I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stared at my ceiling and let the relief roll over me. They were cornered, legally, financially, socially. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one feeling powerless. But the sweetest part came quietly, from someone I least expected, my dad's former business partner, a man named Howard. He called me late in the evening, his voice low and thoughtful. "Emily, I want you to know something," he said. "Your father lied to me too, told me he had your blessing, even showed me the loan documents like they were his victory. I didn't know, but now I do. And if you need a statement for court, I'll write one." I blinked. "Why?" I asked. "Why help me?" He was silent for a moment. "Because I've got daughters, and if I ever did to them what your folks did to you, I'd want someone to hold me accountable too." I hung up that call feeling something new. Not just revenge or relief, it was clarity. This wasn't just about a loan, this was about legacy. About drawing a hard line between right and wrong, so no one ever crossed it again. Not in my name, not on my future. The courthouse wasn't what I expected. It wasn't grand or intimidating. It looked like an oversized DMV building. Cold floors, buzzing lights, and chairs that made your back hurt after 10 minutes. But what was intimidating was walking in and knowing that on the other side of that courtroom sat two people who had given me life and nearly ruined it. My parents arrived just before the hearing started. My mom wore a navy dress I'd seen her wear to church a dozen times. My dad looked smaller than I remembered, tucked into a cheap gray suit that didn't quite fit right. He didn't meet my eyes. She did, but not with guilt, with resentment, like I had betrayed them. I felt Jessica's hand gently press on my arm. "Breathe. Just let the truth speak louder." I nodded. We walked in together and I took my seat. It felt like the air itself knew what was coming. Heavy, tense, still. The judge entered and we all rose. His expression was flat, tired, like he'd seen this kind of family disaster too many times. But his tone was sharp. "Ms. Carter, would you like to begin?" Jessica stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we are here today because Emily Carter's identity was stolen by her own parents to secure a $500,000 personal loan. The documentation has been reviewed by the bank's fraud department, law enforcement, and verified to have originated from the defendant's home address using their internet connection. The signature was forged, her information was used without consent, and the defendants have failed to accept accountability. She turned slightly toward me, then back to the judge. We are seeking full civil compensation for financial damages, emotional trauma, legal costs, and a court-ordered restriction from financial contact moving forward. My mom gasped loudly, like she couldn't believe I had gone this far. My dad just sat motionless, staring at the floor like it might save him. Their lawyer, a man I'd never seen before, clearly hired at the last minute, stood and tried his best to spin it. Your Honor, the defendants did not intend harm. They were acting under extreme financial distress. This was a lapse in judgment, not a malicious act. They are willing to make amends if given a chance. The judge raised one brow. A lapse in judgment involving a $500,000 loan under someone else's identity? His voice was dry. Ms. Carter, did you give them permission to use your name for this loan? I stood. No, Your Honor. I found out when the bank called me. I was never asked. If I hadn't caught it in time, I'd be buried in debt for a loan I didn't even know existed. I sat down. For the first time, my dad finally spoke. His voice cracked. We were just trying to keep the business alive. It was never meant to hurt you. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't. Because if I had never found out, they never would have told me. They didn't come clean. They got caught. The judge leaned back in his seat, reviewing the paperwork silently. The courtroom was quiet except for the occasional scribble from the clerk. Then he spoke. Due to the nature and severity of this case and the clear documentation of fraud, I am granting a temporary restraining order on all financial access by the defendants to Ms. Carter's name or assets. Furthermore, I am ordering the defendants to submit a full financial disclosure within 10 business days. My parents didn't move. I did. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like months. The judge continued, his voice calm but firm. If the defendants fail to comply with the financial disclosure, they will be held in contempt of court. At that time, we will proceed with full damages hearings. This court does not tolerate the abuse of identity, especially by family members entrusted with the care and respect of their adult children. This case will remain under active review. He banged his gavel once, then rose and exited. The room fell into a stunned silence. I turned slowly, catching a final glance at my parents before I walked out. My mother looked like she was about to cry, not because of what they did, but because they didn't win. My father looked straight ahead, jaw clenched, like a man who still didn't understand the gravity of what he had done. I didn't speak to them. I didn't need to. The system had finally said what I'd been screaming inside. This was not okay. This was never okay. Outside the courtroom, Jessica put a hand on my shoulder. You did good, Emily. You stood your ground. I nodded, but I didn't smile. Not yet. Because the truth was, the courtroom battle was only half the war. I still had to deal with the wreckage. My credit score was under surveillance, and my emotional world felt like it had been bulldozed. But for the first time since the phone call from the bank, I felt something anchor me. Not hope, something sharper. Resolve. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about protection. This was about setting the kind of boundary that could never be crossed again. And I knew something else too. This was far from over. My parents weren't going to take this quietly. They were going to try something, and when they did, I'd be ready, because I wasn't the naive, quiet daughter. I was a woman who saw through the lies, and now I had the law on my side. The text came 3 days after the court hearing. It was from my mom. Can we please talk? Just you and me, no lawyers, no shouting, we miss you. For a second, my chest tightened like it always did when she softened her tone. But I had to remind myself, this woman wasn't reaching out because she was sorry. She was reaching out because she was losing. Still, Jessica advised me to take the meeting. Let's see what their play is, she said, but keep your recorder on. Every second. I agreed to meet her at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. Neutral ground, public enough to avoid drama. I arrived early, ordered a tea, and sat near the window. When my mom walked in, she looked like the ghost of the woman who raised me, makeup slightly smudged, eyes puffy from crying, scarf wrapped too tight around her neck, like it was holding her together. She slid into the booth without saying a word at first. Just looked at me, tears already welling up. Emily, she whispered, I didn't know how to fix this, so I kept making it worse. I stared at her, waiting. I wanted to believe she meant it. I wanted to believe that some part of her had finally snapped out of the denial. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "It's a letter," she said. "Something I wrote. I was going to post it online, but I wanted you to see it first." I unfolded it slowly. It was a written apology, neatly typed. She admitted they had used my information. She said they were ashamed. She said they'd take full responsibility and cooperate with the court. It was everything I had asked for. But it didn't feel right. The phrasing was too polished, too rehearsed. I glanced up at her. "Who helped you write this?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" I tilted my head. "It's not your voice. It reads like a press release. Are you planning to post this to clear your name before the next hearing?" Her eyes darted to the side. That's when I knew the apology wasn't for me. It was for the public. I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm. "You're not sorry, Mom. You're just scared. You want to control the story before it gets worse. But it's already out. People know what you did." She reached across the table, grabbing my hand. "Emily, please. This is tearing us apart. Your dad barely sleeps. I can't walk into church without being stared at." I pulled my hand back. "That's not my doing. That's yours. You took something that didn't belong to you, and now you're embarrassed the world sees it." I folded the letter and handed it back. "Post it if you want, but don't expect it to change anything." Her face dropped, lips trembling. "So you won't even try to forgive us?" I stood slowly. "I didn't come for forgiveness. I came for honesty. And once again, you couldn't give me that." I walked out of the cafe, feeling every eye in the room on me. But I didn't care. I'd spent too long walking on eggshells to protect their reputation. Now, I was walking away. For me. Later that evening, I got a ping on my phone. They had posted the letter. And it backfired badly. The comments section exploded. Dozens of locals who had followed the case chimed in. "This reads like a PR stunt. If you really cared, you'd have said this months ago. Sounds like damage control, not remorse." Some even linked to news coverage of the court hearing. And then came the bombshell. Someone leaked the police report. I didn't do it. But I had to admit, it was timed perfectly. Everything was laid out. The forged documents, the address match, the IP logs. My parents were exposed. Fully. And this time they had no one left to lie to. No sympathetic neighbors. No family allies, just each other. And the mess they made. I sat in bed that night, scrolling through the storm they created. And for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. Because the truth didn't need me to defend it anymore. It spoke for itself. I hadn't planned to see him, not alone, not ever again, if I could help it. But fate has a sick sense of humor. I was at the DMV renewing my driver's license when I heard someone call my name. I turned around and there he was, my father. He looked tired, worn down, like someone who hadn't had a full night's sleep since the court hearing. His eyes met mine with something between shame and desperation. "Emily," he said, walking toward me slowly, "please, just 5 minutes." I wanted to turn and walk away, but something in me, maybe anger, maybe curiosity, made me stay. 5 minutes, I said, stepping outside. The cold air bit my cheeks. We stood near the sidewalk, cars passing, people walking by like nothing in the world had happened. He shoved his hands in his coat pockets and looked down. "I didn't come to beg. I just wanted to explain." I folded my arms. "Then explain why you tried to destroy my life and pretend it was love." He sighed. "I started looking into loan options in your name 6 months ago." I blinked. 6 months? He nodded, eyes low. "We were already deep in debt. The house, the business, everything was collapsing. I knew we couldn't get approved with our credit, but you?" He looked at me then. "You were our last good card to play." My mouth went dry. "So you didn't just make a mistake in a moment of panic. You planned it." He didn't argue. "Yes, I looked at your credit report, pulled up old paperwork to practice your signature, even made copies of your ID from that time you helped us apply for a car years ago. It was wrong, Emily. I know it. I was just desperate." I took a step back, feeling like my spine was freezing. "You didn't just steal from me. You studied me, used me like a tool." He didn't deny it. That was what made it worse. "I thought if we paid it back fast enough, you'd never find out," he whispered. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Again, the betrayal I'd been holding in finally formed words. "Do you know what that loan would have done to me if I hadn't caught it? I would have been denied for a mortgage, denied for a business loan, labeled a fraud by association. You didn't just risk your life, you risked mine. And for what? For a home you couldn't afford and a business you couldn't save. He flinched. We built this family together. I just didn't want it to fall apart on my watch. My voice was calm, but firm. You didn't build a family. You built a lie. And when it started falling apart, you didn't try to fix it. You tried to bury me underneath it. The silence that followed was heavy. But I had more to say. This isn't just about money. It's about who you are now. And the man I'm looking at, he's not someone I trust. Not anymore. His eyes filled with tears. But mine stayed dry. I had cried enough. He reached out, but I stepped back. We're done here. I turned to leave, but paused. The worst part isn't what you did. It's that you planned it so carefully and still slept that night. That's what I can't forgive. And then I walked away, my steps steady, my heart louder than my thoughts. He didn't follow. He didn't shout. He just stood there, surrounded by strangers as I disappeared around the corner. And in that moment, I knew whatever love I had left for him, spent it like a bad loan. And now, the debt was his to carry. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, no warning, no phone call, just a plain white envelope slipped under my apartment door. It was from my parents' lawyer, thick with legal language and dressed up like a peace treaty. I sat on the couch, fingers tightening around the paper as I read. They were offering a deal. Drop the civil suit, drop the financial damages claim. In return, they'd agree to plead guilty to the identity fraud charges, accept a reduced sentence, and avoid dragging the case out in court. It was a clever move, one last attempt to control the ending. But the part that made my hands shake, there was a clause. If I accepted the deal, I had to forfeit all rights to speak publicly or legally about the case again. In other words, they'd plead guilty quietly, but I'd have to disappear with it. No statement, no testimony, no closure. My name would be protected, but their reputation would be spared. Neatly, silently. Jessica reviewed the letter with a frown. They're trying to save face, she said, flipping through the pages. They'd rather go down as quietly guilty than publicly wrong. If you take this, they'll walk away with fines and probation at worst. No restitution, no accountability beyond the minimum. I nodded, staring at the coffee mug in my hand. I hadn't slept well in days. The emotional toll was heavier than any bill I'd paid this year. Part of me wanted it to end, to just sign the paper and move on, but another part, stronger, deeper, refused. They didn't just steal money, they stole trust, peace, dignity, and now they wanted to erase the evidence before the ink could even dry? No, not this time. I met Jessica's eyes. We go to court. We finish this. She smiled faintly. Good, because I already started prepping for trial. The next morning, I sent my response. It was one line. I declined the offer. And just like that, the air shifted again. Within hours, my phone rang. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice, trembling and sharp, spilled through the speaker. Emily, we gave you a chance to end this peacefully. Why are you doing this to us? I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because this wasn't me doing something to them. This was me refusing to let them rewrite the story. I wasn't going to let them walk away and pretend it never happened. I wasn't going to disappear just so they could protect their pride. I'd spent months cleaning up their mess. Now I was going to make sure the world knew who created it in the first place. This was bigger than closure. This was about setting the record straight, for me and for anyone else who's ever been betrayed by the people they trusted most. Later that week, the court officially confirmed our trial date. We were going public. Witnesses were called, depositions filed, and every step I took from that point forward felt like justice finally putting on its shoes. I wasn't out for revenge anymore. I was out for truth, and no NDA, no letter, no guilt trip disguised as love was going to stop me now. They wanted peace on their terms, but peace built on silence is just another kind of prison. I was choosing freedom. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Maybe it was the nerves. Maybe it was the weight of everything that led to this moment. As I stepped up to the witness stand, I could feel every eye on me. Family, neighbors, former friends, and strangers pulled in by the spectacle. My parents sat across the room at the defense table. My mom clutched a handkerchief she hadn't used yet. My dad looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. I took a deep breath, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Jessica gave me a quiet nod. Then the prosecutor stepped forward, her voice even. Emily, can you tell the court, in your own words, what happened? I started slowly. In January, I received a phone call from United Federal Bank asking me to confirm a $500,000 loan under my name. I never applied for it. I looked at the jury, then back at the judge. At first, I thought it was identity theft, but when I saw the documents, I realized the address used for the application was my parents' house. The signature looked almost identical to mine, but it wasn't, and that's when everything started unraveling. I explained how I had contacted the bank, reviewed the documents, and confronted my parents, how they lied, how they played innocent, and how I found out later from my own father that he had planned it all months in advance. He told me he had studied my handwriting, that he had kept copies of my ID from years ago when I helped them with a car loan. He admitted it wasn't an accident, it was a decision. I paused. The courtroom was silent. Even the hum of the overhead lights felt muted. I continued, my voice steady but full of fire. What hurts more than the loan is the silence. The fact that they didn't come to me, that they would have let me find out by being denied for a home loan or a job, that they would have let my life collapse just to save their own. My throat tightened, but I pushed forward. And when I tried to protect myself, they told everyone I was ungrateful, that I was tearing the family apart. They went on Facebook. They called relatives. They painted me as the villain. I look straight at the jury now. But I wasn't the one who forged the signature. I wasn't the one who committed fraud. I was the one who got left holding the wreckage. And I'm here because I refused to let them walk away without accountability. The prosecutor nodded gently. No further questions. Jessica gave me a soft look of pride. Then came the defense attorney. He stepped up, trying to tread lightly. Miss Carter, your parents did eventually express remorse. Isn't that true? I stared at him. They expressed panic. That's not the same thing. He hesitated. But you had a close relationship before all of this. I shook my head. No. We had a fragile peace that depended on me always being the forgiving one, the quiet one, the helper. He looked at his notes. Wouldn't you say they acted out of desperation? I leaned forward, eyes locked on him. Desperation doesn't make you forge your child's name and risk her future. That's not desperation, that's calculation. He had no comeback. No further questions, he said, barely meeting my eyes. I stepped down, walked back to my seat beside Jessica, and sat tall. For once, I didn't feel small in that room. My voice wasn't just heard, it echoed. And I saw it on their faces, too. My parents looked like shadows of themselves. They didn't just lose control, they lost the story. And in that courtroom, filled with truth, no amount of tears or twisted words could save them now. The judge called for a 15-minute recess after I stepped down from the stand. I walked into the hallway, head spinning, heart racing. I'd said everything I came to say, but it didn't feel finished. Not yet. Jessica leaned against the wall next to me. You were solid, she said. Every word hit. I nodded, but something about the energy in that courtroom had shifted. It was subtle, like a quiet tension running under the surface. And when the recess ended, I found out why. As we returned to our seats, the prosecutor whispered something to the bailiff, who quickly left and came back with a man I didn't recognize. He walked with calm confidence, dressed in a brown leather jacket and jeans. He looked to be in his 40s, with a sharp jawline and the kind of expression that told you he knew something important. The room buzzed as he made his way to the witness stand. The judge looked confused. Is this a scheduled witness? No, Your Honor, the prosecutor replied, but with the court's permission, we'd like to call Mr. Joel Merrick. He has information relevant to the case. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Proceed. I leaned toward Jessica. Who is that? I whispered. She shook her head. No idea. Joel raised his hand, took the oath, and sat. The prosecutor approached. Mr. Merrick, can you state your relationship to the defendants? He nodded. I run an independent loan consultation firm. I worked with Mr. Carter, Emily's father, last year. The courtroom fell silent. Can you describe the nature of that work? Joel glanced at my parents, then back at the judge. He contacted me 6 months ago, asking for help securing a personal loan using someone else's identity. He claimed it was his daughter's, said she wouldn't mind if it was handled quietly. I refused and reported it internally. But I guess he found someone else willing to help him push it through. The room exploded in murmurs. I could feel the blood rush from my face. I turned slowly and looked at my father, He wasn't pale. He wasn't shocked. He just stared straight ahead, stone-faced. He didn't deny it. He knew this was coming. My mother covered her mouth in disbelief, but even that looked rehearsed. Jessica stood. Your Honor, this confirms that Mr. Carter's actions were not only premeditated, but had been attempted through illegal channels prior to the forgery. This shows intent beyond desperation. This was fraud, full stop. The judge slammed the gavel. Order, one more outburst and I'll clear the courtroom. When things settled, the prosecutor continued. Mr. Merrick, did you document this interaction? Yes, Joe replied. I filed an internal report with my firm. I also retained the original email Mr. Carter sent me, outlining his plan. He reached into his folder and handed over a printed copy. The courtroom clerk took it to the judge, who began reading immediately. Jessica leaned close again. This is it? She whispered. This locks everything in. There's no way they walk away from this now. And I could feel it too. The shift. The reckoning. I looked across the room and saw my parents not as people, but as defendants. And I saw myself not as a victim, but as someone who stood up when it mattered most. When Joel stepped down and walked past me, he paused. I should have spoken up sooner, he said quietly. I nodded, voice steady, but you did now. That counts. The judge recessed court until the following morning. The verdict would come next. But I already knew something deep in my bones. Whatever happened tomorrow, they had already lost. The next morning, the courtroom was full. Reporters lined the back wall. Family members I hadn't seen in years sat shoulder to shoulder with people who once called my parents role models. Even Pastor Green from my childhood church was there. Everyone wanted to witness the fall, or maybe the redemption. But I knew better. This wasn't a fall. This was gravity doing its job. The judge entered, everyone rose, and I held my breath. Jessica gave me a small nod. We were ready. The bailiff handed a sealed envelope to the judge, who opened it slowly and read in silence. Then, in the clearest voice I'd ever heard, he said, in the matter of Emily Carter versus Alan and Denise Carter, on the charges of identity fraud, forgery, and emotional and financial damages, this court finds the defendants guilty on all counts. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, a single sob from my mother. I didn't flinch. I just sat still and closed my eyes for one moment, not in relief, in confirmation. The truth had spoken, and it was louder than every lie they'd ever told. The judge continued. Sentencing will be determined in a separate hearing, but based on the current evidence and the defendant's lack of cooperation, I will be recommending restitution be paid in full and a formal record of this conviction to be made public. Jessica leaned toward me. We got it all. Financial restitution, public record, credit restoration. You won. I didn't feel like I won. I felt like I survived. And then the judge said something unexpected. Miss Carter, do you have any final words before we close today's session? I stood slowly. My legs were heavy, but my voice was clear. Yes, Your Honor. I turned to face the courtroom, not the judge. I faced them. A year ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen was losing money, but I was wrong. The worst thing is losing faith in the people you once believed would protect you. My parents didn't just break the law, they broke something deeper. And I don't know if that can ever be repaired. But I stood here today to prove something not just to them, but to myself. That silence is not strength. That forgiveness is not a shield. That truth, even when it hurts, matters more than peace built on lies. I turned toward the judge. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here so this doesn't happen to someone else. So if another daughter is sitting at home, afraid to speak up, because the person who hurt her shares her blood, she'll know she's not alone. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge blinked slowly, his expression unreadable. I sat down, heart steady, throat clear. For once I wasn't drowning in emotion. I was standing in it, strong. My parents didn't look at me, not once. And that, I realized, was the final nail, not the verdict, the shame, the silence, the loss of control. That was their punishment. And mine was freedom, the kind that doesn't come with handcuffs, but with courage. A week after the verdict, I was finally breathing again. Not perfectly, but deeper. I'd returned to my routines, morning coffee, evening walks, and quiet Saturdays with my phone on Do Not Disturb. But just when I started to believe the storm had passed, another envelope showed up. No return address, no postmark, just my name on the front in black ink. For a second, my heart sank. Another threat? Another trick? But when I opened it, I knew this wasn't from my parents. The handwriting was different. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photocopy of a loan agreement. I sat down, already feeling the chill crawl up my spine. The letter read, "Emily, you don't know me, but I knew your father. My name is Leonard Pierce. I was a private lender." Off the books. "Your father borrowed $250,000 from me over a year ago, promising to repay within 6 months. He used your credit as part of his proof of solvency to win my trust. He showed me your employment history, your clean records, told me you'd co-sign if needed. He lied. When I found out, I pulled the plug on future funds. But I thought you deserved to know. He didn't just risk your name with one bank. He sold it, over and over. You were his collateral." I sat frozen. My hands shook as I picked up the copy of the loan document. My name wasn't on it, but Leonard was right. All the attachments had records from my life, old pay stubs, tax forms, screenshots from my LinkedIn profile. It was like my entire identity had been packaged and pitched like an asset. Rage crept into my throat, but it wasn't the same kind of rage I felt before. This was deeper, more surgical, because it meant my father hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't just taken one risk. He had been using me like a currency, bargaining my name across shady back rooms like it was a chip in his game of survival. I called Jessica. She came over within the hour, read the letter, and said exactly what I was thinking. This changes everything. We filed the letter as new evidence even though the trial was over. If he used your identity in multiple places, she said, you might have grounds to open a separate federal case or push for a harsher sentence in sentencing court. Either way, this isn't done. I looked out my apartment window as the city buzzed below me, alive and indifferent. I wasn't angry anymore. I was cold, focused. I had given my parents every opportunity to be honest, and they gave me a mask and a maze instead. What hit hardest wasn't that my name was misused again. It was that he had told me straight to my face that he only did it once, that he made a mistake. But this meant he had been playing chess the whole time, and I was just another piece. I folded the letter carefully, sealed it in a folder with the others, and placed it on my kitchen counter. Then I picked up my phone and called Jessica back. "Add it to the case file," I said. "We're not finished yet." Because now I knew my revenge wasn't just justice. It was exposure. And every hidden move they made, I was going to bring it into the light. Sentencing day was quiet, no crowd, no reporters, just a few rows of tired faces and a judge who looked like he'd seen too many stories like mine. But this wasn't just any sentencing. It was the end of a battle I never asked for, a battle that had drained my energy, shaken my identity, and forced me to stand in rooms where my own last name felt like a weapon. My parents sat side by side, stiff, unmoving. Their lawyer spoke briefly, asking for leniency. "They're first-time offenders," he said. "They're sorry." The judge didn't nod. He didn't blink. He just looked at me. "Ms. Carter, do you wish to speak before I deliver sentencing?" Jessica had told me I didn't have to, that I'd already said more than enough, but I stood anyway. "I used to think betrayal was loud," I said, voice calm but steady, "that it came with slammed doors and raised voices. But I've learned it's quiet. It sounds like your father saying, 'Trust me,' while filling out forms behind your back. It looks like your mother's face pretending to know nothing. It feels like silence in your gut when you realize you were never being protected. You were being used." My parents still didn't look at me. So I went on, "This wasn't one mistake, this was a choice. And when they were caught, they didn't apologize, they attacked. They posted, they lied louder. What they did wasn't just fraud, it was an erasure of everything I built. And all I ever asked for was the truth." I turned to the judge. "I don't want revenge, I want protection. From them. For myself, for anyone else they might hurt." The judge nodded once, and then he spoke. "Alan and Denise Carter, this court sentences you each to 3 years of supervised probation, 180 days of community service, mandatory financial restitution in full to the plaintiff, and enrollment in fraud rehabilitation and ethics training. In addition, the court grants Emily Carter a permanent financial protection order. You may not open, co-sign, request, or manage any financial product in her name, for the rest of your lives. A silence fell like a curtain. My mother broke into quiet sobs. My father sat stone still. They weren't going to prison, but their world was ending all the same. And then, just as the judge was about to adjourn, I stood again. "One more thing," I said. Jessica gave me a quick look, unsure, but I pulled a white envelope from my bag and handed it to the bailiff. "Please submit this to the court as public record. It's a formal waiver of any inheritance from Alan or Denise Carter, effective immediately." The judge raised an eyebrow. My parents looked stunned. "I won't carry the debt of this family into my future," I said, "not emotionally, not financially." "I'm done." The gavel dropped. "Court is adjourned." I walked out of that room, lighter than I had in months. No applause, no dramatic music, just the weight finally lifting from my back. Outside, the wind was cool and the sky stretched wide and open. Jessica caught up with me and smiled. "That waiver, you didn't have to do that." I shrugged. "I know, but it felt right. They spent years taking from me. Now they can keep whatever's left. I'm not going to wait around for apologies that will never come." She nodded, proud. And with that, we parted ways. I went home, packed a bag, booked a one-way flight out west. Just me, a blank notebook, and the kind of freedom you only earn by walking through fire. I wasn't running anymore. I was rising. And this time, no one, not even my own blood, was going to steal that from me. If you thought that was wild, imagine finding out your own parents sold your future behind your back. What would you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget, trust is earned, not inherited. Like, share, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories that prove sometimes blood isn't thicker than betrayal.